Greetings and
Okay,
welcome to our conversations on COVID and development. I'm very pleased today that we have with us Takashi Miyahara, who is a Senior Deputy Director General in the International Bureau of the Ministry of Finance of Japan. And Japan, of course, is not just a major economy, but also a big player in the development scene and providing direct support to many countries through its bilateral programs, as well as a major shareholder of the multilateral institutions and very instrumental in helping to shape the international response. So I wanted to welcome you, Takashi-san, to this conversation. Thank you for being here. And I wanted to perhaps just start a little bit with you could share with us sort of what has been uh, the Japanese contribution to helping developing countries, and particularly low-income countries in Africa, but also countries in Asia, to deal with this crisis so far.
okay. Thank you very much, Masood. I'm very much delighted to be a part of this dialogue program, and I'll do my best to provide you with the information relevant from the Tokyo side. Well, as as you kindly introduced, Japan has been proudly, the part of international cooperation for development assistance. And under these emergency circumstances, Japan has been responding quickly to the one feature of our response should include the emergency assistance scheme, which was launched in this April. And in this scheme, the we provides ODA loans, which will be available at the most concessional terms of all the JICA schemes. JICA is a provider of our official ODA loan. And in the peacetime, this most concessional terms applies to the poorest and most vulnerable countries only. But under this emergency situation, we provide this most concessional terms to low and middle income countries as well. And yes, the target of this new scheme is mostly COVID affected countries in Asia Pacific region, but the countries in Africa and other regions are also within our scope. And this emergency loan comes with very limited qualification conditions, such as excluding countries with the high risk debt assessment by the IMF, or the countries with the IMF program off track at the time of before crisis. But at the same time, we will positively consider providing this emergency loan to the countries which are being supported by the RFI or the RCF of the IMF, which provides the perhaps much needed co-financing opportunities for those countries. And then perhaps the only condition which may be important to us is that the amounts provided through these emergency loans should not be used for repaying existing debts of the recipient countries. And then these loans will bear 0.01% interest rate and 50 years of repayment period with a 4-year grace. And the maximum 50 billion yen per borrower will be provided. By the way, for now, the total amount of the loans to be provided under this emergency scheme will be 500 billion yen, or about 4.6 or 7 billion US dollars worth for the next 2 years. And so far, very unfortunately, the JICA, or the Japanese government, have received lots of requests and inquiries, and some of the total amount of such requests or inquiries already exceeded the total size of 500 billion the Japanese yen. Then the requests are being processed to fast track, and at a fast track by the Japanese standard, but the first loan under this emergency scheme will be signed tomorrow, after just 2 months after we launched this initiative. And we also have the grant scheme. The amount is not very big, but about 53 billion Japanese yen, earmarked for supporting medical supply to countries of weak health system. And also we provide a technical assistance in a very intensive manner to support strengthening medical capacity of recipient countries, including building capacity of health service providers, and so on. And multilaterally, perhaps I would not have time to point to everything, but most prominent one would be about Japan's participation to the DSSI initiative of the G20 and Paris Club. On Japan's part, 7 countries have already requested a suspension to JICA or JBIC or the NEXI as the Japanese bilateral official creditors, and a total amount of repayment to be suspended under in accordance with this DSSI stands currently at 42 billion Japanese yen, and then I'm sure the number will be bigger as more eligible countries come to talk with the Japanese official vendors.
You've been very quick in terms of responding. As you said, you already have about $5 billion now in these very long-term and virtually interest-free loans, of which some part has already gone out. Tomorrow is going to be the first one, but hopefully the others will follow quickly, because in this crisis, as everyone is saying, speed is going to be of the essence. And then about $500 million worth of support for health systems and grants that's already been provided. And you're also participating in the DSSI, which of course is the debt service suspension initiative that has been put together by the G20 to allow about 75 countries, the poorest countries, to defer the payments on their official bilateral debt that is due until the end of this year. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of broader international response as well, if I may, which is that so far we've seen now we're 3 months into the crisis. If you look at the health impact, it's maybe in some ways not as bad as some people had been anticipating in terms of new infections and fatalities in Africa and South Asia. Although more recently you begin to see a bit of a pickup in a number of countries, so we shouldn't get perhaps extrapolating too easily from the first few months. But the economic consequences for the crisis have been really very severe already. And there are so many stories already of countries and people and businesses having to make some terrible choices in terms of how they manage during this period. And the initial response, the G20 came up with this debt suspension initiative on part of the debt, the bilateral part. There was some encouragement for others to think about it. They encouraged the multilateral institutions to step up, and initially the IMF and the World Bank and the regional banks, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the IDB, all tried to do a bit more. They did it, but now we are 3 months into it, and many people are beginning to say that the crisis is much bigger than the response so far, and both in terms of the speed, but also just in terms of the aggregate volume. And people are beginning to worry that that if you look at the projections for these countries, low-income countries, for the next few years, it will take many years for them to recover from this the worst recession that they have faced in 80 years. So it's really going to be a big problem for them. And I wanted to get a little bit your sense. I know there's a G20 meeting coming up in a few weeks' time. About 3 weeks, there'll be a G20 meeting to take stock. What do you see as a state now of the international response, and what do you think we should be looking to do more and hoping to get out of the upcoming discussions in the G20? And of course, at the moment, Japan is not the chair, the presidency of the G20, so you can't speak for the G20 as a whole, I appreciate. But from the Japanese point of view, what would you like to see coming out of the international response beyond what we already have seen?
Well, as you pointed, the G20 has been working very closely with the IMF, or the World Bank, and the other MDBs, and the G20's the central point of the sort of the request to the MDBs is, in a word, maximizing the net positive flow of finance to those affected countries. And perhaps this number is already in the heads of many people concerned, but the World Bank President, Mr. Malpass, sort of declared that the entire bank group is ready to provide $160 billion worth of assistance by June next year. And the group's emergency finance package include the $6 billion worth from the IBRD and IDA, as well as $8 billion worth from IFC. And I'm not updated now about the speed of formulating the program or project and then implementing or dispersing those amounts. But as a matter of firepower, myself and the colleagues of my ministry are, by and large, sort of confident, at least at this moment, for the bank group's ability to cope with the request under this emergency situation. And the same may apply to the IMF. And I'll skip the details, but the IMF also provided, sort of declared that they have $1 trillion worth of lending capacity, and now their website today says $83 billion worth for 77 countries are already, provided with the lending toolkit, such as RFI, RCF, or FCL, or augmented standby, or so on. So in the upcoming G20 meeting, ministers meeting next month, I understand that at least the bank and other MDBs are expected to provide more detailed progress country by country, if possible, regarding their emergency support. And then as for the MDB's participation to the debt service suspension initiative, which has been on the table of discussion for a while. Well, there still is a variety of views about that, but my view, or I think this is in broadly in line with the government official position, is that we may push the MDBs for providing new money, rather than pushing them into the suspension of their own debt payments, because bank staff keep telling us that such a suspension would likely hurt their credit worthiness at the market, then in turn hurt their ability to raise money from the market, and then this reducing their firepower. So then the size of the impact would be to 10 or even higher, more times of the potential loss to firepower compared with the amount to be saved by the MDB's own debt suspension. So once again, we have seen by and large a good progress in the MDBs providing the new finance, but we would ask them to do more depending on the situation evolving.
I think that's very encouraging, and I must say that my personal view, for what it's worth, is also that I think that at this stage, the most productive route for the MDBs to contribute to the crisis resolution is by providing net new money rather than by embarking on a complex effort to suspend debt service payments to MDBs for all the reasons that you outlined. The test of that, of course, will be to see if that is indeed happening, as you say. And I think the fact that you're going to have a meeting in a few weeks, and as you say, you'll be able to get, and I think it does really have to be country by country, because if you can provide new money, net new money in the aggregate, but if individual countries are actually giving back to the MDBs more in debt service than they are getting in new money, that's not a very good outcome. So I think being able to have that information would be very helpful to be able to reinforce the argument that the best route for the MDBs is to go through the provision of new money. And as you saw a few days ago, the World Bank very helpfully put out a set of tables, country by country, showing the debt service that was due to all of the creditors, multilateral, bilateral, and private, month by month, I believe, for this year, and then also for the next year. And I think now, against that, is a very good benchmark to be able to show what the new funding has been for the same set of creditors, so we can see in practice what is being done by each major creditor to help during this crisis. I want to just move a bit from the MDBs to and the multilaterals to the third big block, which is, of course, the private sector. And this, as you said, there's some variety of views on what the MDBs should do, but there is probably even greater variety of views on how the private sector should participate in the support to the countries. And as you remember, the G20 called upon the private sector to provide support, comparable support. But since then, there have been a number of discussions between the countries and the IIF, which represents many of the private creditors. And there are some conversations underway, but there is still not quite yet a meeting of minds on what is the best way for the private sector to participate, and also what is feasible for the private sector to do, given their own fiduciary responsibilities to their own depositors and shareholders. I wanted to get a little bit your sense of what you think is the best way for the private sector to be engaged in this effort.
Well, it's a bit difficult questions for me, but I try. Well, well, the private sector creditors, of course, private, and even if they could join the service suspension, cooperation, and then that, each action should be voluntary. So, I don't have a clear picture how to do this, but first thing to do to show them that the temporary suspension of the repayment should enhance the financial soundness, or I would say fiscal soundness, of the recipient countries, and thus in the medium to long term should benefit the creditors by way of enhancing the sort of potential repayment profile. Well, that's it. It's not a very specific and an actionable way in my mind, but well, the big picture should be like that, I think. And of course, keeping pressure, in a sense, pressure on them by the G20 or even bilateral the creditors side, be working. And then actually, I understand that the IIF has been working very hard, getting all the private creditors together and to talk about the pros and cons for them of possible service suspension. So that's a sort of in a sense positive side of the development these days.
Indeed. No, I think that there have been many conversations, and Tim Adams, the head of the IIF, has been very active in trying to see if they can find some common ground between, of course, the private creditors, are so, as you know so well, are themselves a very diverse group. We're talking about 100+ entities who are creditors, and they range from commercial banks to asset managers to other groups as well. So I think we have to recognize that they are not as easy as in 20 years ago, when you talked about trying to get the private sector creditors around the table. You basically had a half a dozen key actors, and you could get them around the table, and they had similar interests, so you could more easily find a common way forward, which looked at the long term and the short term in the same way. Now, of course, because the creditors are so diverse, each of them has a different perspective, including how they value the short term and the long term, and the transaction versus the relationship. So all that makes it more complicated. If you don't mind, Takashi, I'd like to move a little bit away from finance and talk a bit about the health side. And I know global health has been a big priority for Japan. It was part of your own presidency last year. And I wanted to get a sense of how you see the consequence of the crisis and pandemic preparation now affecting the international support for global health security. And I just want to share that Larry Summers, who who is also the chair of our board at the Center for Global Development, made a comment 2 years ago, which really has stuck with me. And he said at that time in his speech that the WHO budget for pandemic flu was roughly the same or a little bit smaller than the annual salary of the Michigan State football coach, just to give a sense of how much the world was underinvesting in sort of global public goods, and of which, you know, pandemic preparation is one. And I know for Japan, it's a high priority to deal with universal health care for global health security. I want to get a little bit of your sense of how you're thinking and your colleagues are thinking about this issue now.
Well, thank you for an important, the questions or issues you raised. I think, this the current crisis is a very, very unfortunate, development, but so much so that it should work as a serious wake-up call to all the policymakers of the global development assistance world, that the strengthening the health system and its finance should contribute to the resilience country, or as well as the regional or global resilience to such pandemics, in terms of both human lives or human health, as well as economic the terms, and then the financial implications. So financial and fiscal, I should say. So we, including the G20 countries and all others, should take this very unfortunate but opportunity to restart the sort of serious discussion and action for strengthening the global health system. So now the Japan has been talking closely with the Saudi presidency of G20 this year, as well as some like-minded countries with a strong interest in global health, about how we prepare for the joint finance and health ministers meeting, which is to take place sometime before the G20 Leaders Summit this year, and that that would be the second joint meeting, and the first one proudly hosted by Japan last year. But then, this year, the importance of such the joint meeting is all the more, all the bigger, I think. So we need to have, the meaningful and fruitful agenda for the joint meeting, and to start with, identifying the most critical and urgent issues for the finance and health ministers to discuss together, toward helping the developing countries to promote or strengthen the health system, both for responding to the crisis now, as well as the preparing for the next one, if it happens, very unfortunately, in terms of preparedness. So I can't tell whatever specific issues, but we should have a broader perspective for strengthening the global health.
Yes, certainly, and clearly, I think one of the big messages coming out of this is that as we think about global health security, we have to recognize that it can only be achieved if it is grounded in strong national health systems. We can't have superimpose a parallel network of global health security on the top of weak health systems in the component countries. So I think that's how we balance that, because for many developing countries there are already a lot of pressures and strains on their health systems, and that's why the sort of universal healthcare work that you have been also promoting so actively in Japan has becomes a very important part of the equation. Maybe we could conclude a little bit by going to the, if we step back and look at the broader consequences of this crisis right now. The crisis comes at a time when the support for multilateral systems and multilateralism has already been under strain in a number of countries. There are also sort of geopolitical tensions which make it harder to find common ground in many areas. Uh, and the we think forward and say, okay, 2 years from now, we will have a number of big issues on which we will have to find solutions, whether it's the global health security that we're talking about, whether it's going to be how we deal with the debt issue in a number of countries, because we may find that at the end of this crisis, the level of debt is unsustainable in a number of countries, and all the creditors will have to come together. Whether we think about climate change and how we find a common solution to climate. So, uh, if you were to kind of put on your look into your crystal ball and think forward 2 or 3 years, how do you think we should think about the evolution of the international development cooperation and how it will be impacted by this crisis? Any thoughts? I recognize that they're all going to be at this stage a bit speculative, and in 6 months we may have the same conversation and have very different views. But I wanted to get a little bit what your current thinking of you and your colleagues are is about how the development cooperation might change in the future.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting and deep but important question. And well, this is 100% my own view, and perhaps no official line to talk on this in this question. But well, perhaps the countries and people, I mean policymakers around the world should start with recognizing once again that we are interconnected. Well, this the pandemic, I mean, the spread of the virus throughout the world, sort of showed or reminded us very clearly that we are living in a connected world, and not only the virus but also the economic activities. It will in each countries the activities have been suspended or even shut down, but also the flow of goods and services are also suspended due to malfunction of the global value chain. So this is a serious and stark reminder that in reality we live in a connected world. So perhaps we start with that. So I wish that such a serious recognition once again should bring us back to more serious discussion about the multilateralism and then how to promote them, how to bring them back. And let's see what else. Well, on the development assistance front, perhaps after the COVID-19 crisis and then the recovery phase, we may give a refreshed look at our approach to the development assistance. In that, not only the developing countries but advanced economies as well would be experiencing the transformation of economic and even finance structure of the world, and then with such knowledge, we may need to, give a fresh look at how are the economies and the finance or even society of our developing partner will have been changed, and then how we to change our approach to development assistance. Only very broad statement only, but that's what is in my mind.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Japan has always been a stalwart supporter of a rules-based system, international system. And I think, as you say, that set of rules and that system has to evolve as the world is evolving. And I think the big challenge is to recognize that the multilateral system and needs to change, and just as the requirements for multilateralism are changing as the world is changing, but it does not mean that it is less needed. It is just as needed, but it just also needs to be changing. And it's Japan and other major countries developing and developed that will have to find ways to define what that new path is going to be. So Takashi Miyahara, I thank you for taking the time to be with us. This has been really enlightening for us, and I hope we'll be able to continue this conversation in a few months' time and see how things are evolving. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Masood. Yes, I'll be more than happy to come back if possible to find what will be there in front of us in 6 months of time or so. Thank you very much.